Today we are talking to Iswarya, who translated Tamil writer Jeyamohan's short story collection 1 Million Footsteps into English. In 1 Million Footsteps, which comes under the category of literary detective fiction, we meet Ousepachan, a jaded maverick ex-police officer with razor-sharp wit. He turns his gaze inward, dwelling on the complex minds that commit crimes. The story collection is layered with history and myth, challenging us to confront deeper truths. To understand the depth here, we must look at the man behind the prose. Writer Jeyamohan is a preeminent force in Tamil literature. His career spans over 300 short stories and several landmark novels. He is a vital voice, bridging heritage and contemporary Indian narrative. Bringing this world to life is the translator V. Iswarya. She teaches English literature at the Manipal Academy of Higher Education. She was a 2024 South Asia Speaks Fellow for Translation. She perfected her craft under the mentorship of the esteemed Arunava Sinha. Her work captures the nuance and gravity of Tamil literature for all of us. This collection is a meditation on human nature you won't want to miss. Here she is, Iswarya, talking about her love for books and literature.
I would say I started off in a sort of reading culture, like many kids in the 90s, with simply for due to deprivation in some sense. We were in a world that had just globalized, and we didn't have ready access to the kind of media that children have access to right now. So we didn't have the distraction of cell phones. Cable TV came pretty late to me, and so on. So I grew up on this steady diet of print culture. And very surprisingly, it was mostly at my grandparents and aunts' houses that I grew up, and so in Chennai, and I read what we now understand as rather age inappropriate reading, because it was mostly all of the weekly magazines, and the weekly magazines in the 90s would actually carry a lot of sexist humor, secretary based jokes, and
Yeah.
fat shaming people. All of this was like super common. It was the steady media diet of that period, but I was just voraciously reading everything that I could lay my hands on. So, in a sense, I think it's helped me. It's helped me get a sense of what the mainstream culture in Tamil itself was, and I didn't grow up in that sense very alienated from the mainstream Tamil culture. But I think it was in my end of my schooling years that I sort of completely switched over to reading in English. Before that, I had kind of done all the regular reading that your average nerdy Tamil teen would read, which is Kalki. Like Kalki was the big fan favorite of that time. So I had read Ponniyin Selvan, Sivagami and Sabadam, uh, and so quite a bit of that. And I had I had that passion for historical romances like all teenagers, and all of that happened. And I somehow didn't catch on to contemporary Tamil literature at all at that period, because there was nobody to introduce it to me. And so, because of school and because I always had a taste for reading, I got into reading regular English, romances as well, like your regular Three Musketeers and Monte Cristo and so on. It just went on from there to, say, George Orwell and
Mm-hmm.
Charles Dickens, and I had a whole Jane Austen summer. I spent I spent a whole summer sort of like just tracking down every book she wrote, and my personal favorite even now is Emma, uh, because very flawed kind of a protagonist. I identified so much with her very meddlesome nature. So I had that kind of a, sort of a very Catholic reading in my youth. And from there, I went on to study English literature in my undergrad and postgrad and so on. So once that became my field, I started kind of reading more and more of the classical English canon and so on. And the more time I devoted to that meant the less I could even dream of reading Tamil. And I sort of drifted away from Tamil like that for about roughly 20 years, I would say.
So, when did you come back to Tamil literature?
it was only around the pandemic time that I restarted with a little bit of Tamil reading. It's not that I lost touch with Tamil or like I was a bad reader of Tamil or anything. So, one hilarious episode I can remember is there was a competition in my school, I think 11th or 12th grade, for us to write an essay on this classic in Tamil called Silapadigaram. I'm sure you must have heard of.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I read the original along with its notes like in 2 weekends. It was an absolutely crazy thing to do, but I managed to do it simply because I took it as a challenge and do it. But I think I didn't feel that kind of a challenge with a lot of reading that came my way in the modern circle, because once again I was only relying on like the weekly magazines and all of that. They didn't have any kind of a literary standard, and also quite shallow stuff. At some point I could start predicting their plot lines and so on. So I didn't get any serious introduction to it. The best I knew was like say Sujata or Balakumaran, and that's pretty much it. And from there, because I pivoted hard into reading English, I was under the delusion, like a lot of other young people, that literature existed only in English, sort of thing. So, if somebody had asked, like, say, 20-year-old me to name contemporary Tamil writers, I would have been like, I don't think anybody is writing in Tamil right now, sort of thing. So, very ignorant and very overconfidence that comes from ignorance at that point. So, that's all. That's how I kind of like drifted away from English, and I mean, sorry, from Tamil. And then back in the pandemic time, I knew that I had the ability to read Tamil, and on and off I was reading some stuff that I accidentally came across. I would say the first serious essay by Jeyamohan that I read would be The Obituary of Harold Bloom, which is a very interesting way of my two worlds colliding. Yeah, so Harold Bloom died in 2019, and at that point he was one of my favorite critics growing up, and there are only two obituaries written for that I could come across in the Tamil sphere for Harold Bloom. One was, I mean, I don't want to name the writer now, but he was a winner of the Sahitya Academy Yuva Puraskar. And I personally know him also in real life from my university. And he had written something to the effect of, "Oh, good riddance, the old man is gone," kind of a thing. And I was very, very shaken by that. And then I was wondering, is this the general response of the Tamil world to this man dying and all of that? And then I came across Jaymohan's obituary note, which was very detailed and very, impartial and serious appreciation of Harold Bloom's position. I figured out that here is another Tamil writer who kind of like sees the major cultural icon that Bloom was for English readership of a certain generation, but at the same time was he also looking at how he was a little jaundiced about Eliot and other people, like because of his own baggage and so on. So this was I would say, the first serious piece of literary evaluation that I was reading in Tamil, and it came as a complete breath of fresh air, because I was wondering, I was worried that I was only going to hear more of fire and brimstone condemnation of Harold Bloom. But this was such a refreshing piece to read. But once again, I think I wasn't keeping up with my Tamil reading very much, because this was again pre pandemic. It was during the pandemic that, as I describe in the foreword to the book, in the middle of all the doom scrolling on social media, I come across this screenshot that's floating around that says something about, oh, the contemporary writer controversies poster child Jay Mohan has kind of once again said something very offensive about lower castes and all of that. And then I wonder what that is all about. And then out of sheer curiosity, I go back and read this story, and then that story has such a stranglehold on my imagination for such a long time, because I'm taking time to process all of this and figure out where is this coming from. So that was my first example, I would say, of reading a very serious Tamil short story after a very, very long time.
Which is that short story?
1 million footsteps.
Right.
which is the reason I kind of like then chose to pick it up for
Yeah.
translation.
Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. You preempted my question. Then how did this journey into translation happen with Jaymohan?
Yeah, primarily I would say that my major introduction to contemporary Tamil reading was from Jeyamohan. And I think there's a very important role that was played by also Suchitra Ramachandran, fellow translator and very good friend. I had been in touch with Suchitra for quite some time before all of this pandemic started. Usually, because she was also a postdoctoral student working on consciousness at that point, and my PhD was on consciousness, and I generally used to cry like all these PhD kids about when am I going to finish the thesis, and I'm feeling such imposter syndrome and so on. So I was doing all of that, and so we were kind of like friends in a very long distance sense. She was living in Switzerland at that point, and so but when we met once in person, she got me this book, Sangachitrangal, and asked me to read it. And then that time I remembered, oh, this is something I have read before, because I had read parts of Sangachitrangal back when I was a reader of the Tamil magazines like this Vigadan and Kumudam and all of the things that used to turn up at home. Sangachitrangal was a series that used to come up in Vigadan, where Jay Mohan was explaining Sangam poetry with anecdotes and illustrations every week to the readership of Vigadan. Incidentally, he's now restarted a series for the weekly magazine Vigadan now, which called Megangalin Kural, after some, I think, a gap of 20-25 years now, which is amazing, I think. So what happened was I sort of like then came across Sangachitrangal, and then like that's how we met briefly for once or twice, and then she went back. And what happened was, so I was somewhere aware of the existence of Jay Mohan. I had come across this story, and that is when the Mori Prize was announced for the first time, the inaugural edition. And I had worries about. The first edition was interestingly also restricted only to Tamil translations, and because of that, I had worries about whether this would be a conflict of interest if I submitted to it, because I knew Suchitra personally, and she was like, what, we met twice, what do you think is happening here? And she was like, no, I'm not even going to be on the jury, please go ahead and submit. I'm encouraging everybody I know, of all the Tamil readers I know around me, to try their hand at translation. Please go ahead and submit a story. So then I wanted to translate 1 million footsteps for that collection. But I realized quickly that it's a story that will not probably meet the criterion of 7,000 words in English. So huge. And then I kind of like started wildly casting about for what do I translate now. And then I go to social media and ask people for help, like, hey, can you all catch me up on some contemporary reading?
Uh,
And right enough, there's a friend called Melinda who suggested this story called Ammayappam. And once again, it was mind blowing. It was mind blowing because specifically it spoke to my life situation at that point. It's a story about a carpenter, not any carpenter, but sort of very incompetent carpenter, a drunkard, a wastrel, and all of that. And this man is not even trusted enough to repair a chicken coop. And then he kind of like comes and coaxes this lady of the household to somehow let him make a ladder. And he botches the whole job so badly that kind of he's left shamefaced in the end, and so on. So this is just the at the surface level, this is what is happening in the story. But you also realize quickly that there is a whole different personality for this carpenter. He's called the crazy carpenter in the story because fundamentally he's a sculptor. He's a sculptor who's capable of like making the Shiva Tandavam come alive in sandalwood. Now, this is the man who's being interested with doing menial jobs like repairing chicken coops and making ladders and so on. And so, naturally, he's frustrated and he treats this job too lightly, and that's the reason he ends up blundering in it. Now, this spoke to me because I was stuck in a dead end job. I was stuck in a dead end job teaching English to people who didn't care two hoots for English. And I was here sitting and kind of like trying to make sense of, say, Tom Stoppard and uh, Helen Gardner and all of that. And I'm like trying to go and talk to people who will not read three pages together and who will kind of like just stare at your face like you're some alien standing in front of them and gesticulating. I realized, oh, this is a universal story. This is about artists everywhere in the world who are kind of like forced into a menial day job that sort of really kills their potential off. And no wonder the man became a drunkard. And then his wife leaves him and so on. It's a really hilarious story. But it's also like extremely poignant because it's speaking to the condition of artists all over the world. And it spoke to me at that point about the kind of academic engagement I was caught up in. I was not even getting to teach a literature paper at that point. So I was here kind of like just explaining noun and verb and tense and all of that to first year undergrads who could not care less. And so it really rang true for me. And that's basically how I made my way back into Tamil reading. So I would say I am a rather relatively new Tamil reader. My Most of my reading belongs to the last three and a half years at most. And I'm also a little bit of a slow reader, so there's not much that I've read in the last 3 years also for me to kind of like proudly list out. Anyway, because of my uh, rather comparatively better English reading experience, I have a sense for what I really like and what I'm looking for in a writer. And so if I quickly tire of certain writers. I quickly give up on certain writers when I feel like this is not engaging me at the level I really want this to engage me. And so, for that reason, I'm also like a bit of a very selective reader in Tamil, I would say.
Mhm, mhm. So, other than Jaymohan, if some of our listeners they want to read the contemporary Tamil literature,
Yeah,
whom do you recommend?
this is the challenge actually. The all of my prelude was to tell you that if you push me to name specific Tamil writers, I can at most tell you some of what I've read, but I don't think I'm qualified enough to even recommend.
No, as a reader, you can always recommend.
I'm saying I'm a very poor Tamil reader because my Tamil reading is very limited. I would say, of course, I started strongly with Jeyamohan. I would say right now and then I interestingly I've read more of Tamil literature through English translation than in actual Tamil script. So I've read a bunch of Perumal Murugan, and I also incidentally translated one of his non-fiction books recently.
What is the title of the book?
So it's this book called Students Etched in Memory that came out through Penguin Random House last year. So that was my first book length translation. So I would say that my favorite Perumal Murugan book is Kulamadari. I think in English that's Seasons of the Palm. Then right now the interesting writer I'm kind of like exploring is Yuvan Chandrasekhar. He's not been translated very much into English. And very interestingly, I'm reading this book called Enkona Manidan, which I can loosely translate as a man of eight dimensions. It's written in this very interesting style where you can't tell who's talking at any given time. It's all in the form of dialogue, but it's not dialogue attributed to specific people. So it's just freewheeling conversations with his uncle that he recalls. And then the narrator kind of like gives you multiple footnotes into which he kind of goes into different anecdotes, and like there are pages where the size of the footnote exceeds the actual text on the page and all of that. It's like a very experimental kind of form. So this is, I think, me discovering Tamil literature on the go as I'm working as a translator. I am stumbling into all of these important writers, and when people tell me, hey, you should read this, and then like I kind of very faithfully pick it up from there and start reading. So uh, I'm pretty excited about reading Yuvan Chandrasekhar right now, and I hope somebody translates this into English too.
You have been reading and you started translating, and you said a couple of books you translated, and probably some short stories too. Do you think your reading experience the literature that you are not translating other than just reading? Because of translation, do you feel you're as a reader you have evolved because of your translation?
Interesting question. I think these two are going in parallel tracks for me. One thing that has happened when I read in Tamil is that in my head I am kind of constantly stopping the text and thinking about how would this sound in English. That's something that I am kind of like doing in moments when I'm not, when I don't even notice. See, most of the time you are carried along by the tempo of the story itself, so you don't kind of like stop and think about things. But becoming a translator has now made me sort of stop and often wonder specifically about texts that are very rooted in their culture, on, oh, how would this sound in English? What a delicious job would it be for somebody to turn this particular line into English, kind of a thing. So it's acquired that second layer, I would say. But because I don't translate two ways, like because I don't do anything from English to Tamil, uh, primarily my reading in English, I still would say, is kind of unaffected. um, but one thing that I've become much more acutely aware of ever since I started translation is about how words sound. I mean, I was always aware of that as a reader. I would kind of like follow along with the rhythm of things. But I think I've now developed more of a nose for what really sounds fake. That's I can probably explain with the example of, the recent controversy about the Commonwealth Prize, right? Um, so when I read that story, I had that feeling like the serpent in the grove as I am reading. I had this strong feeling about, my God, how terribly fake this sounds. That sense of where there's a certain authentic human voice, and there's a certain lilt to the quality of the prose, and a certain vision behind the image. All of this, like all of these things, I think I'm much more finely tuned into now than when I was just reading for pleasure, I would say.
As a reader, have you slowed down reading speed? And
Sometimes in my very bad moods, I attribute it to the fact that I am probably spending too much time online, and probably my attention span has shrunk, and it's maybe old age and all of these things. Like, we all have those mini existential crises every now and then, I think.
now you told me why you chose to translate 1 million footsteps because of that first story that you have read. Give us a detailed introduction of 1 million footsteps, a short story compilation.
1 million footsteps, the story that uh, lends its title to the anthology, is the first story, as I said, that first serious literary story that I came across from contemporary Tamil. And it was, it stood out to me in two ways. One, it uses the very common uh, form that we associate with genre fiction, which is detective fiction, to try and go beyond what detective fiction usually does. Detective fiction, as we all know, like from reading Sherlock Holmes and let's say Agatha Christie and so on from our childhood days, usually is interested in um, how a certain crime happened and who was the killer, or like who was the criminal mind behind it. And very often, the end of the story comes with, I mean, figuring out who did what. We are barely given like a couple of lines of explanation for the why. And very often, detectives who are explaining this to their rather the reader stand-in friend in the story, like Watson, would kind of tell you, oh, that is how sometimes people do things, and like, there's a certain mysterious quality to why people do the sort of things they do. And that kind of a, perfunctory sort of a close happens with a lot of detective fiction. Sometimes people don't even go into this at all. You have all of these incredible monsters who are uncovered in the course of a story, but then you leave it at that. You just like shrug your shoulders and think, yeah, this is how sometimes people are, and then walk away from it. I think what stood out to me, the first thing that stood out to me in the story was how these stories really begin with the why. I mean, there's a whole explanation for the how, not much of an emphasis on the who. The who is almost incidental, but almost all of the explanation and all of the historical background and the metaphorical significance, the cultural notes added to it, everything is sort of centered on the why. And that is what I like about the explanation that Jayamohan gives in the preface to his book, which is, he says, I think of these stories as investigating human nature itself. So it's reaching for questions of what makes people do the kind of things they do. Because, crimes of passion you can explain. But this titular story itself is fundamentally not at all about a crime of passion. I mean, there is a crime of passion that does happen with this, young man infatuated with a married woman. But the core of the story is really not about the crime of passion at all. The crime of the passion is far easily excused, in fact, excused by the reader, by the narrator, but not by a certain character. And that really forms the crux of the story. How do you produce an individual who does not, like you and me, operate on the level of, oh, we must be forgiving about crimes of passion? What kind of blood and iron must have gone into making an individual who is unforgiving of human frailty? And that's the kind of question that you're left with, and that's the kind of question that lingers with you long after you've closed the book. So that was the first feature that stood out to me. The second was also that the story was in no hurry to tell you a story in the first place. There is so much of scene setting that is happening. You see so much of the banter that happens
Yes,
between
yes, yes, yes.
Ousepachan. He goes on for, let's say, about 20 pages very coolly, just telling you all sorts of meandering details, in the history of shipbuilding in the port of Bepur, in the case of 1 million footsteps. The tone of the banter is also in such a way that it doesn't feel like exposition. That's the other thing that you feel with a lot of details, where you're being fed details of, oh, this is going to be significant later, like Chekhov's gun. You have to watch out for this sort of thing. It doesn't feel like that. There's a lot of times when there's so much rambling among these friends and they are drunk, and each of these people have a character. All the people surrounding Ousepachan, like, who Kumar.
One of
Yeah.
them being Jim.
Yeah. So you have this Kumaran master, you have this Sridharan Nair, and then they're all constantly flinging some caste-based insults at each other. They make fun of this stand-in figure for Jay Mohan, like you say, and then they make fun of Nair's family histories. They make fun of Christians. They make fun of Christian conversions, and they also make fun of the prime minister of the country, which is there everywhere in this narration. But all of this happens at the peripheries, that you feel you ease into this conversation, and you're not specifically looking for one story to follow or a lead to discover and all of that. So you don't get that particular thrill of being a co-investigator of a crime that you usually get in the genre of detective fiction, like where you are trying to be one step ahead of the detective in trying to find out who's the criminal. None of that happens. This is a very rambling, it's like, eavesdropping on some very interesting uncles in your neighborhood. That's the
Correct.
general vibe you get about this.
Correct. Correct.
So, and they're like, there's like a lot of blue humor happening, and they make jokes that are only permissible in these all male circle. It goes on. It goes on like that, that you don't feel that there is any kind of an agenda to whatever they are saying at all for a very long time. And then, by the time you are cued into where the story really picks up steam, and there's usually that kind of a point in each story where they say, oh, we had already come to the edges of our seats because we knew that we something important was going to come up now. And so After that, the way they are listening in rapt attention, the way Jemon, I mean, the way Ousepachan goes into detailing the history of Kerala, for instance, in Ona in Mukku, the Trail of the Wolf, where he talks about how right from the time of Zamorin, how the traders who were in coastal Kerala, sort of like some families flourished, and how certain Nair families were kind of left behind, and there's a whole history to it. And then you get into all of this myth about the land of the Bhagavatis, and then mm,
Mm-hmm.
the goddesses of the land, the notion of women turning into vengeful goddesses. All of this is sort of like given to you as background information before you even start processing what is happening in this particular story. That, of course, is again a sign of a very confident storyteller who knows that they don't have to kind of constantly appease you with, red herrings in order to hold your attention.
Now, who is your favorite contemporary writer writing in English?
My contemporary favorite writer in English, I would say, unfortunately, is not very contemporary right now because he passed away a few months ago. Tom Stoppard. And I think that's a very interesting way again to connect to both Jeyamohan and the larger conversation we are having here. I did my PhD on him, and I'm the reason I'm mainly, I mean, I was mainly attracted to Tom Stoppard is also in some sense the reason I'm attracted to Jemon's fiction, which is there is beyond the storytelling, beyond the plot, there are some fundamental philosophical questions that both of these writers are very deeply interested in. And the parallels keep kind of coming back to me when I think about it because um, Tom Stoppard was interested constantly in questions like if everything is relative, where do you find truth? Or things like if mortality is the only constant in life, what values do people live by? These kind of like very serious moral questions he could take and then turn them into high comedy. He could turn them into extremely humorous and at the same time very erudite kind of comedy. And there's also a lot of scholarly areas that he goes into. He can kind of like, research some 300 years of Russian history in order to write a trilogy like Coast of Utopia, kind of thing. So I'm sure now you would see the parallels, right,
Yes,
between
yes, yes, yes.
both of these writers. Their interest in history, their interest in philosophy, their interest in deeply human questions, their belief that literature matters beyond just polishing your prose or beyond just presenting a story that will sort of leave the reader on the edge of the seat kind of thing, that in the end a very romantic notion of literature that there is some form of higher story, I mean higher truth telling about fiction or about drama that you find through literature alone and not through any other mode of engagement in the world. So that sense of that conviction that I see in both of these writers, that is something that led me to I think naturally transition from being a big fan of Tom Stoppard to being a big fan of Jay Mohan now.
Now, 1 million footsteps, the title itself. In fact, there is lot of discussion and he used lot of details about popular Muslim community. It struck me in a very, very different way, right? They have been here for a long time, probably came here centuries ago, and the culture is intertwined now. And the current political discourse taking all this into a different direction.
I would like to point out something that you also said now, which is um, today when we talk about writers, very often you would see this repeated everywhere that, oh, writers need to be politically engaged. Writers need to kind of like comment on today's political crisis and like they have to kind of offer some sort of a running commentary on every burning issue today, sort of thing. But if you see in a lot of interviews and everywhere, you would see Jaimon commonly remarking that he is very apolitical. And that is something that is very often interpreted as, oh, he really doesn't care, or like he doesn't engage with the problems of the day. He's sitting on some kind of an ivory tower, sort of an impression. But I think what you pointed out now is an excellent example for how his engagement with Muslim culture, in especially the Mapla Muslim culture in this particular story, is deep, sustained, and insightful, as opposed to merely raising slogans about one particular crisis, about one particular ruling party, and about one particular situation of persecution, sort of a thing. I think what he's doing there is, um, this is again something that I commonly go back to with Tom Stoppard as well. He turns every political question into a larger moral question. Now, political questions can change from moment to moment. People can switch allegiances and they can alter their behavior and alter their tune based on whichever party is in power. All of this is pretty fickle. But your moral stances come from a certain kind of uh, unchanging instinct, where if you want to do right by what it is to be a good person, then your engagement with the Muslim community cannot just be superficially decided by these external factors that are happening today, but by your deep understanding of the ethos of the community itself, by treating them as full human beings about whom you have a perpetual curiosity, the way you have perpetual curiosity about everybody else. So I think his engagement with these questions is like deeply moral rather than just political, because the word political can often be misused in the at the service of something that is very time serving.
Right. Right. And the other one we mentioned, we discussed briefly earlier. It's about, especially the like a story gunning. I
Yeah,
think that's the first story, right?
yeah,
See the women characters as though it appears till the story comes to end, as though they are in the background,
yeah. Mm.
and suddenly the way he turns the character, and in the end, in fact, I see this in almost even in the White Elephant, Elisa. She has a relationship with the protagonist, and the way in the end, he gives brief details about that lady, and in the end, she becomes a full blown character with. Almost she behaves like a true heroine in the end, right? This particular thing I have observed in his other stories too. What has been your experience of reading Jayamohan's women's characters?
Very interesting question. Um, I would like to say that this is somewhere coming a little bit also as a woman reader, as somebody who reads a lot of feminist fiction as well, and so on. Um, I agree that Jayamohan creates some very complex, nuanced female characters. They are like definitely you can certainly see their character arc with, uh, but sometimes yeah. See, it's a mixed bag in terms of some places they are just there as sort of expected figures following a certain expected line, and sometimes they are like they do very unpredictable things. What I would say is interesting about both the characters that are complex and characters that are sort of like just there to move the plot a little, whichever way they are. I think they all have a sort of deeply symbolic placement in the stories itself. So, um, I would, as a reader, prefer to look at it this way. There are several characters, like for instance, I'll specifically speak about this one novel of his, which is widely read as a sort of feminist story called Kanyakumari. It's a novel that he wrote uh, primarily around about a man's insecurities around two different powerful women characters that he has sort of like associated with. So this man called Ravi is a successful film director, like from an assistant director to director kind of thing. He's moved and he's haunted by his memories of his ex girlfriend, with whom he's out, and there's a whole traumatic episode involving her being gang raped and all of that. And somehow this man feels emasculated by that entire incident, that that particular failure of his own, I mean, he sees it, he sees his inability to protect her from it as a sort of a personal failure of his own masculinity, and it kind of like continues to haunt him to the point that he becomes a womanizer, and he becomes a drunkard, and he becomes a general purpose misogynist and failure in life, and so on. It's like a very interesting character study of the man himself. But I would say that in this story, and in, say, Aram, where you have the central lady who turns the fortunes around for the poet there. And let's say in the other story that I'm going to talk about, which is Pintodarum Kural, in all of these, you actually have women characters whom you can read at one level as flesh and blood human beings, like they actually exist and they have an Aadhaar card kind of a thing. But I would feel that, reading them at that level sort of just takes away a lot of the symbolic significance, the layers that they have as archetypes. So many female characters in James fiction are very interestingly have this additional layer of being a very powerful archetype. um, I think I've read, for instance, Suchitra arguing that the lady in Aram, the Song of Righteousness, as a sort of modern day interpretation of Kannagi, the myth. And similarly, you can see these two women in Kanyakumari, the one who is, previously violated in that gang rape. It takes the image of the goddess in that Kumari also as a sort of a image, an archetypal image, to which this man sort of like then grafts on to that image all of the female relationships in his life. So in a sense, you get this strong archetype, the archetype feminine, frequently occurring in Jamon's fiction. For instance, this particular image of the yakshi. I recently watched a play dramatized version of this story called Kadesi Muham by Jeyamohan once again, which talks about the way the Yakshis cast a spell on men who pass by that area, sort of a thing. So this there are these very powerful archetypes that he employs, very often goddesses, who sort of he's drawing from myths, he's drawing from local legends, he's drawing from these stories of Neeli and Bhagavati and Yakshis and so on from the southern Tamil Nadu and Kerala sort of an area, that that particular color, that particular layering is visible in a lot of these women characters. Now, what interestingly happens in Kanyakumari is the man is forever stuck in this loop of self condemnation because he cannot get over that incident because he feels emasculated. But you get to see that that woman herself, called Vimala, very easily moves on from that incident, and she kind of like becomes a scientist, and she goes about exploring the purpose of her life because she doesn't want to be reduced to one traumatic incident in her life. So what I'm saying is there are very often times when these women emerge as very striking individuals. They are very powerful, but at the same time, there is a lot of this particular perspective of a man, often the narrator, staring in the face of some kind of a mystic feminine archetype that kind of beats his comprehension. Now you will see that in the character of Radhamani in 1 Million Footsteps.
Correct.
He says, the fire I saw in her eyes was something that I could not kind of fathom at all.
Correct.
This particular kind of a feminine mystery that eludes the perception of most often the male narrator who's telling you the story is a very common sort of image that you see in a lot of fiction by Jayamohan. And it happens once again, like, the feminine as a sort of a mothering and grounding influence that you see in Pintodarum Kural. where the wife of the protagonist is actually like a rather common woman. You don't see her as a, why I'm specifically bringing this up is this is one particular way of writing the feminine, which I think is very true to where Jaymohan is coming from as a writer, as opposed to a lot of other feminist writing, especially by women, where we speak so much about female agency, about women being the people who decide their life and all of that. You definitely have that in a character like Vimala in Kanyakumari, but that's not the only way of imagining feminine power, I would say. Like it sometimes the power of the feminine really comes from the substratum of that culture in which it is embedded, and what the feminine means in that particular culture to somebody brought up like that. And then I think he's constantly also exploring this clash between the very matrilineal system of Kerala that he comes
Correct.
from and the very patriarchal Tamil culture in which he's writing.
Correct. Correct.
So
Perfect. Correct. Very good observation. So, what has been the reception so far?
oh, I would love to hear from more readers, but whatever I have heard, people have, I think, many people, especially people who read it for the first time on Bookstagram, were a little bit stunned by the fact that these were, uh, circulated as detective fiction, but this is very different from the kind of detective fiction that they usually read. And I think some very perceptive comments have come so far from the Tamil readers of the novel, who speak about how much this delves into uh, the archaeology of its culture, how far it really talks about the limits of rationality. That's something that happens in At the Roots, if you remember, like where he says there are things that your rational mind can never comprehend at all, and that's where he says we wait for God to sort of like open a door for us. And so there is a sort of a mystical little intuition that sort of like leads people to discovering things. And then that and there are some stories where for instance the last story in the collection called Kaimukku, where any amount of rationalizing kind of like doesn't finally find you an answer. You now know why they did it, and still it's not even the criminal at this point that stuns you, but the father of the criminal. I think he's the most interesting character in that entire book, because you get to hear so much about how his upbringing was, how he grew up, how his circumstances were, and what kind of an unbending moral stance he had maintained. And then when you subject that to some sort of an acid test, it's a very interesting premise, because if you think about what Jaymohan said about Aram, he says it is about all of these human beings being subjected to some kind of acid test. I think it was about Aram or about Abyss that I remember reading this
It
comment
is about
about.
Abyss, I think. Yeah.
Ah,
Mm.
yeah. So in that sense, if you think about Kaimuku is very much that kind of an acid test. It's really kind of like seeing how far you can go and still hold on to your morality. And as much as it shocks us when people really withstand that test, which is what happens a lot in Aram. Like, how far can somebody stand that physical pain and the mental trauma and still go to Mount Kailash?
Yeah, Peruvali.
Peruvani. So what happens is that kind of when you subject beings to this utmost level of acid test, what happens to them? You are stunned both by the people who survive it, as in the case of Peruvali, and also by the people who fail it, as in the case of this father in Kaimuk. So it is really about subjecting human beings to that extreme kind of a duress to see what really lasts, what really comes out of it. How far can you stress test human nature?
Now, what are your upcoming projects?
Oh, thank you. So, my immediate upcoming project would be finishing a set of non-fiction again by Jeyamohan. At this point, it's little a bit become a I don't know. It's become the theme of the talk that I'm circling around this one particular author, I guess. So anyway, I translated some of the political essays by Jeyamohan for a frontline. I'm also translating some more of these political essays by Jeyamohan for on subjects of nationalism, Hindu nationalism, and the mixing of religion and politics, and those kind of and censorship on account of religion and so on. So those essays will be kind of like wrapped up in a month or two, and they're probably going to be released somewhere in early 2027, coming out from Jagannath. But the thing I'm very excited about is the next upcoming project, which I'm yet to officially start, I've applied to some grants and so on, which is Pintodarum Niyalin Kural, which is an epic saga of a South Indian Union leader called Arunachalam, who in the 90s, following the fall of the Soviet Union, has a sort of mental breakdown. He has a mental breakdown because he is a staunch believer of the communist ideology. He's a member of the Communist Party and so on. And in some sense, he is subjected to once again a moral crisis. He comes to know of this character, this communist thinker from South India in the 1950s called Veerabhadra Pillai. I think this is a fictional character only, and not a. I mean, but it might be based on some real people. This Veerabhadra Pillai has been buried from the official history of his party, like the Orwellian notion of an unperson. You know, where the records are removed and this person
Yeah,
is
yeah, yeah,
dropped into a
yeah.
memory hole, sort of thing. He has been kind of officially scrubbed out of all records of the Communist Party, all because this man dared to discover that there was an economist in Soviet Russia called Bukharin, Nikolai Bukharin. At that time, in 1950s, when he comes to know of the existence of Bukharin, who is sort of executed after a trial, I mean, show trial after, I mean, by Stalin. There is one of these Stalinist purges that operates, and he's executed shortly afterwards. But his widow, Anna Larina Bukharina, is sent to Siberia for exile. Like many political prisoners in Russia, she's sent to Siberia, she's starving and all of that. For decades together, she stays alive after memorizing the dying declaration of Bukharin on why he is innocent and how his memory is to be vindicated. She stays alive solely in order to bear testimony to this man's life. And right enough, it's, I think, post Khrushchev time, there is a sort of actual inquiry in which she's able to say this, repeat the statement verbatim that she has been practicing every day orally in front of a court, and she gets Bukharin's name cleared. Now, this novel is really about the title is something I can explain. It says Pintodarum Niyalin Kural. Pintodarum is to follow, Niyal is shadow, and Kural is voice. So, very interesting thing that you might notice is I can share a link with you this week. Just this week, Jeyamohan was interviewed by a magazine, a weekly magazine in Ukraine.
Oh, that's interesting.
And
Mm.
in that particular interview, he talks about this novel where Bukharin sort of then is sort of buried in Soviet Russia in a sort of same way that Veerabhadra Pillai, who discovers his fate, is also buried by the local Communist Party. So there is a certain pattern to this. And so Bukharin starts haunting Veerabhadra Pillai until Veerabhadra Pillai becomes a complete drunkard and sort of like dies on the streets and so on. And then this man Arunachalam, who starts reading the unpublished manuscripts of Veerabhadra Pillai is similarly sort of, he loses his mind and he is confined to a lunatic asylum and so on. And that is where this feminine influence that I was talking about, he is sort of redeemed only because his wife is sort of able to pull him out of the whole ideological trap that he's caught in. So, and what is exciting for me as a translator about this book, beyond the theme, beyond like this vast scope of history, is the fact that it's an extremely experimental form of novel. You start with a straightaway third person narrative which tells you about Arunachalam and his family and his estate and where he's working, fellow union workers, what are the things happening in the Communist Party, and all of that. And then segues very suddenly into see, it's a book divided into 12 sections. So, book one, book two. Around book four or five, what happens is suddenly you start reading straight away the unpublished manuscripts of Veerabhadra Pillai. And this comes up in different forms. It is in the form of diary entries, it is in the form of short stories that Veerabhadra Pillai wrote, it's in the form of one act plays he wrote, it's in the form of translations he did of Alexander Pushkin or Osip Mandelstam or all of these Russian literary figures. And then you have like a short story or a play in which Dostoevsky and Tolstoy are characters. And then you get stories in which Bukharin is a character along with his wife. And then you get a story of his wife's Siberian exile. And then you get a story of, and you have like this collection of poems apparently written by refugees in Siberia or like the exiles in Siberia, and so on. And then there is like, again, Jeyamohan becomes a character in this. And so Arunachalam starts having a debate with Jeyamohan within the novel, and then he writes letters, and the novel actually ends with a letter written by Jeyamohan to Arunachalam saying, yeah, this is how I'm telling your story.
How many pages total novel?
Oh my god, it's 758 pages in Tamil, which you can generously just assume as a double the page count in English. It's such a challenging story in terms of form. The form is constantly shifting.
Yeah.
But fundamentally, it's about the dangers of ideology. The dangers of how you can get sucked into a certain ideology and start justifying. You can very quickly lose your moral grounds because of your submission to that ideology, no matter what the ideology is.